In a series of videos I'm doing on the state of intercity passenger train travel in the US in 2023, I've talked about the best states for Amtrak, and I've also talked about the cities with the most beautiful train stations, many honorable mentions and a few dishonorable ones. I've talked about the route network around the country and the frequency of daily service, with red being the most frequent and light blue being the least frequent. And I've also talked throughout the videos about the states that are helping fund train routes in their states by subsidizing Amtrak to the tune of 240 million a year total. And now I'd like to talk about where Amtrak doesn't go or doesn't go enough. Those are in the what I call the American train deserts. I'm going to talk about the states with low or no train service in 2023. Now here are the rail deserts, as I call them, in different parts of the country. You saw the map before of the routes. It looks like it goes everywhere, but there's a lot of places that there is no passenger train service at all. And some of it's kind of surprising. You would expect it more out west where it's more thinly populated and the cities are spread out. But there are a lot of places where there are a fair amount of cities, but there's still no train service. For example, in Texas and in the South, a lot of the South doesn't have train service. But one of the areas I'm going to focus on in particular will be in the middle of the country, and I'll talk about those states coming up. So these are the states that they don't have any service, or I think that they don't have enough service. And with the exception of one state, Wisconsin, none of these states are providing a subsidy to Amtrak for service in their state. Texas might be. There's one service that is publicly subsidized that goes from Dallas up to Oklahoma into Kansas, but I'm thinking that it's pretty much Oklahoma and Kansas that provide the subsidies for that train. So let's start off talking about the states in the West. And the first state is Idaho. It only has one station in the entire state, and it's way up in the northern panhandle of Idaho. The Amtrak doesn't go to the major cities in the southern part of the state. It doesn't go to Boise or Twin Falls or Pocatello. It just goes to a station called Sandpoint, way up towards the Canadian border, and it's on a train that goes from Chicago to Seattle. And when it stops at Sandpoint, it stops here in the middle of the night. And it's not a short drive. If you wanted to go from Boise up to Sandpoint to catch a train in the middle of the night, it's a 5, 6, 7 hour drive. So it's really remote. But this is the only train station with passenger service in the state of Idaho currently. And then the next two states, it goes to reason that they would not have train service, and those are Wyoming and South Dakota. Wyoming is the least populated state, people per square mile in the country, and South Dakota is just above it. And when you go to either of those states, we were in South Dakota last year, and we also went into Wyoming. You'll see a train line like a single track, and it looks like it's not even really built for real heavy freight train travel. Although in Wyoming, they used to have a lot of coal being mined in Wyoming and then taken by train east. I don't think that's as much of a thing as it used to be, but it was quite the thing in the past decades. So it's not a big surprise that these states don't have any train service today. Very few cities. But one city that used to have train service, and I've actually gone through Cheyenne, Wyoming when it had train service, when I took a train once from California through Denver on my way to Chicago, and the train went up from Denver to Cheyenne and then over east. And anyway, this is just a beautiful station that's still there, and it was designed by the same firm that designed the Portland Union Station, and they also designed a famous building on the Harvard University campus. So this firm got around, and it's in that Romanesque revival, Richardsonian Romanesque style. I just think it's a beautiful station. It'd be great if service could be restored someday back to Cheyenne. So those are the states in the West. And then surprisingly, there are several states in the Midwest that I think could provide way more service than they do. And the first state is Iowa. And you can see here, you see a lot of train lines emanating out of Chicago, and there's a lot of service in Illinois. And in a previous video, I highlighted Illinois as well as Missouri in terms of subsidizing passenger train service, and also Michigan, which subsidizes every train line that goes through Michigan. But Iowa has one line and just a little part of another line way down in the southeastern corner of the state, and it has 6 stations. And the train that stops at those stations is a train that goes from Chicago to the San Francisco Bay Area, the train I was mentioning before that I took. So you see that this train line is way down at the southern end of the state, and much of the state is not covered. And Iowa does not provide any subsidies to Amtrak to provide any service. So I'll just show you the stations on this line. It'll be quick because there's just 6 of them. So we'll go from the west to the east. Here's Creston, Iowa, very good sized station. Osceola, and then Ottumwa. And I just wanted to note, I used to work in this building at the Ottumwa train station one summer during college. I worked for the Burlington Northern as an engineering intern, and we did a lot of surveying in Iowa and northern Missouri, which was really a good experience. But that's their station. And then Mount Pleasant. And then on the Mississippi River, there's Burlington, Iowa Station, which Burlington Northern is named after Burlington, Iowa. The long name of former railroad was the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. And it's now part of Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the freight railroad. So this is the station in Burlington, Iowa, and I think it's a really interesting station. You don't see too many prairie modern stations, and you don't see many stations that were built in the 1940s, built during World War II, which is unusual. And then there's one other station on another line that comes down from Chicago and cuts through southeastern Iowa on its way to Kansas City and ultimately to Los Angeles. So Fort Madison, Iowa, also on the Mississippi. So that's it for the stations that are in Iowa as compared to Illinois, which has dozens of stations on multiple lines. And I just wanted to show that even though Illinois has a lot of train service, the train doesn't go everywhere in Illinois either. It doesn't go to Rockford or Peoria, for example. But getting back to Iowa, as I mentioned, it doesn't go to the northern part of the state. And here's some of the cities that it doesn't go to that it could go to. It doesn't go to Des Moines, the capital, the largest city in Iowa. It doesn't go to Ames, Iowa, the home of Iowa State University. And then Marshalltown, good-sized town, Cedar Rapids, and also Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is. So the trains used to come out here. Iowa has 99 counties, and I'll bet you that the train went to all 99 counties once upon a time. But this is some examples of some lines that could be put in to strengthen the train travel in the state of Iowa and connect it to Illinois as well as Minnesota. This just shows one of the former lines and the route that it took, and there's even more cities that it could go to, like Dubuque and Cedar Falls, Fort Dodge, Sioux City. So there is a history there, but it's up to the state of Iowa whether they're going to provide any subsidies like the 20 some odd other states that do provide subsidies that helps there to be a fair amount of passenger train travel in those states. So here's some of the stations that did once exist, and I can't say whether these buildings are still standing or not, but here was the station, one of the stations in Des Moines, the Rock Island station. And here was a beautiful station in Cedar Rapids once upon a time. And there is still a station building in Davenport, Iowa, the Quad Cities area, another area that's not served by passenger trains currently. And there's still a station in Iowa City where the University of Iowa is, a former Rock Island station. And also there's a station in Ames, Iowa. So it would be great if there would be train service to a state capital, to the largest city of the state, to the major universities in the state. There's a lot of room for improvement in Iowa. And one other thing I'll mention is that Iowa is the first state that always has a presidential primary. and they get to choose who are going to be the early leaders of each of the parties in the presidential campaigns. So it'd be nice if they would step up and, while they're rating and judging everyone else, to improve their own act. People of Iowa deserve more in the way of alternative forms of transportation rather than just driving or even rarely flying. Okay, the next state, Wisconsin, is also a surprising state given its history of progressiveness, that it only has 8 stations on one line, and it's the only station I'll mention in this video that does provide a subsidy to Amtrak. It provides the smallest subsidy of any state that does give a subsidy to Amtrak. It provides $700,000 a year for providing 14 trains a day, 7 in each direction between Milwaukee and Chicago. But the service west of Milwaukee, that's not subsidized. So here is the train line that comes up through Wisconsin, the Empire Builder, that goes from Chicago to Seattle. And I'll show you the stations in Wisconsin. And again, this will be pretty quick because there aren't that many. So we'll go again from west to east. Here's La Crosse, Wisconsin, has an attractive station. Toma, with an Amtrak train coming through, the Empire Builder. Wisconsin Dells, which is a very popular tourist destination. A lot of people from the Chicago area go up to Wisconsin Dells, very family-oriented place. Small station. I don't know how many people take the train to go to the Wisconsin Dells, but you do have that opportunity, that possibility. Going east, Portage. And then Columbus, Wisconsin, which is the closest station to Madison, which is the state capital and the second biggest city in the state and home of the University of Wisconsin. And Madison is 30 miles away to the south from Columbus. But that's what people would have to do to catch a train these days, is drive that 30 miles up to Columbus to get a train. And then Milwaukee has a nice modern station. And I featured the Milwaukee Airport Station as an honorable mention in my other video of most attractive train stations in the U.S. I thought this was a really interesting modern take on the prairie style of architecture. So this is the Milwaukee Airport Station. And then finally, there's a station near the Illinois border in Wisconsin, Sturtevant, which has a suburban style train station with an overhead walkway. So like Iowa, there's a lot of cities in Wisconsin that don't have train service. And I also put a box around Rochester, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is located. Another place where you would think there would be train service because there'd be a demand for it, especially for people who are sick. They might not want to drive to Rochester, so it'd be nice if they could take a train. But the cities in Wisconsin, as I mentioned, Madison, and then other cities we've all heard about, Green Bay, Oshkosh, Wausau, Manitowoc, and Sheboygan, and also Eau Claire. So here's some possible routes that could be added, especially coming up from Chicago to go to Madison, and it could also connect with the station at Wisconsin Dells. If Wisconsin provided a subsidy for such a train, I think Illinois would want to sort of tag team on that and reinstitute service to Rockford, which would be on the way to Madison. So there's different possibilities. And again, Wisconsin's another state that votes in these presidential primaries and can set the tone for the rest of the country. But again, they could do more on their own for their own population of providing more alternatives than driving. So here's a former station in Madison that's still there, waiting for the return of train travel. And here was a train. It looks like it was using the suburban Metra style double-decker cars from the Chicago area, but they would have a train that would go, I guess, up from Chicago or maybe over from Milwaukee to go to Madison on football Saturdays. So there was a demand for such a service, but I think Madison just seems like a big city that a lot of people speak very favorably of and go-to city, but it doesn't have train service, so there's something missing with Madison. And here's another attractive station in West Madison. And Oshkosh has a station still standing. And so does Eau Claire. They're all just waiting for the return of passenger train service in Wisconsin. Okay, the next Midwestern state I wanted to talk about is Indiana, which also does not have very many stations. And Indiana recently had a subsidized service from Chicago to Indianapolis on a train called the Hoosier State, but they backed out of that. And so that service was stopped. So Indiana has, through the middle of the state, they just have a train that runs 3 days a week in each direction, the Cardinal. It goes from Chicago to Washington, D.C., and it goes through Indianapolis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And then there's another line that goes from Chicago to New York and cuts across northern Indiana and goes to a couple of stations. And that's it. So in Indiana's case, they tried subsidizing a service. They didn't feel like enough people rode the trains. I think they were averaging the lowest number of riders per train of any subsidized train in the country. It was like 50 riders per train. And I don't know what that figured out to in terms of subsidy per train, but it had to be pretty high. So it's too bad. And so Indiana is not a state that I would push to reinstitute more publicly subsidized passenger train service because they just backed out of it. So they're kind of going to be the way they are for the near future at least. But let me just show you the stations in Indiana. So right outside of Chicago, right across the Illinois border is Hammond Whiting. This is before you even get to Gary, Indiana. And this is one of those Dollar General type stations that I'm not particularly fond of, that 10 or 20 were built around the country in the 70s or 80s. That's what they have there in Hammond Whiting. And then South Bend, I was surprised to see their station. It looks very temporary. It's just not what I pictured as a station that would serve the University of Notre Dame. And this is the former South Bend train station, Union Station, designed by Fellheimer and Wagner. It was built in 1929. It was designed by the same firm that did Grand Central and my favorite station in the country, Cincinnati Union Station, as well as some other very significant stations around the country. So the station is not used anymore for whatever reason in South Bend. And then Elkhart, Indiana, going to the east, and it's the home of the Elks organization, Elkhart, and Waterloo near the Ohio border. And on this line, Gary, Indiana used to have a train station. And if you've seen any videos by other YouTubers of Gary, and I just watched another one, this is what Gary looks like. It's just like a mini Detroit. So they once had this beautiful station, but all the windows have been knocked out and it's been vandalized, and it's just really sad looking. And then recently they closed another station on this line, Michigan City, which looks like it has a nuclear reactor in the background, but they closed this station for whatever reason. So Indiana's really retrenched. So let's look at the other line going south from Chicago towards Indianapolis. So the first station going south is Dyer, Indiana, station built by Amtrak. Amtrak, by the way, does not own most of the train stations in the country. They own 10%, maybe 20% of all the stations. It's a small percentage. They own Chicago Union Station, they own Philadelphia 30th Street Station, and some other decent-sized stations, but a lot of little ones. And then going south, Rensselaer, where Amtrak also built the station. I mention that because a lot of times the states will build stations. For example, Pennsylvania or Illinois or Connecticut, they've all built stations for the passenger train lines. But here Amtrak has done so, not the state of Indiana. And then here's the attractive station in Lafayette. So at least students at Purdue University can use the train to go to Chicago or going south and east. And then Crawfordsville, another station. Amtrak owns the facility. I'm not sure what is considered the facility, whether it's the little sort of shelter on the platform or whether it's the station building or both. And then on the line, Indianapolis, which I think has one of the most attractive train stations in the country, Union Station. It's not what it used to be. The building still stands, but the waiting area is not as grand as it used to be back in the day. And I show this picture because during the day, there are no trains that come to Indianapolis. They took away the Hoosier State train. So the other train, the Cardinal, it only arrives very late at night or very early in the morning, one direction or the other. And if you think that's bad, Cincinnati, it's even more in the middle of the night. So this next station, Connersville, also the train only stops here in the middle of the night for Connersville. So that's it for the state of Indiana. And now I want to focus on 3 states that I think are especially critical if passenger train service is really to become a bigger thing in the whole U.S. I mentioned before the passenger rail deserts in the U.S., and I call this the Bermuda Triangle. And the triangle includes Indianapolis and Cincinnati, which does have service, but the train only runs 3 days a week in each direction, and it only stops at Indianapolis and Cincinnati, 2 of the most beautiful train stations in the country, in the middle of the night. And there's not a whole lot of other service in this part of the country. So the first state I will talk about is Ohio. And you can see from this map all the trains that are going into Michigan and Illinois, as I mentioned previously. And the train lines, by the way, are the ones indicated in red. The green lines are bus connections. So you can just see that Ohio, the train line just runs along the northern part of the state on its way from Chicago to New York. And from Cleveland, it cuts down through Pittsburgh, and then you can either go down to Washington, D.C. or over to Philadelphia. And then there's the service way in the southern part of the state. The only station within the state of Ohio in the southern part of the state is Cincinnati. The other stations are across the river in Kentucky. And one thing I think is significant here too, why I'm showing this regional map, is there's no train service from Ohio to Michigan. So Michigan has a lot of train service, and I talk about that in my best states video for the Midwest, but their train lines all go towards Chicago. Nothing goes down to Ohio. And Michigan subsidizes all of their train lines, and Ohio does not give anything to Amtrak, so there's no subsidized service in Ohio. That's partly why the train doesn't go from Michigan to Ohio, because it would just stop in Toledo, I guess, because Ohio doesn't want to subsidize any passenger trains south of Toledo. So here is another map. And if you haven't watched one of my previous videos, the circles with the numbers in them, this is a map from the Amtrak website, these maps, and what they indicate are the congressional districts for a state. That's just a point of information. And they also indicate, Amtrak does, who owns what rail lines, what private carriers, or in some cases Amtrak actually owns the track, but not in many cases, mostly in the east. So for example, the red line that goes down through Cincinnati, that's the CSX Railroad. And up in the northern part of the states, mostly the green line is the Norfolk Southern Railroad. And then CSX also owns the track going northeast from Cleveland. So I mentioned Cincinnati. It's my #1 station in the whole country. I just think it's a fantastic looking station, Union Terminal. But it only gets 1 train in each direction 3 days a week. So there's 1 day of the week where it gets no trains at all, maybe more than 1 day, because maybe 1 or 2 of the days of the week it gets a train in each direction. So it gets 2 trains, but they both arrive in the middle of the night. And I mean, look at this station. The interior is just fantastic. So the station is so underutilized. I will say at least they moved back into the station. They had moved out of the station into a little crummy station, and this whole station sort of sat vacant, and then they tried to revitalize it by making it like a shopping mall, and now they've brought train service back in a very limited way. And just another view of the main area, which has restaurants, but just a beautiful station. And just to go back to that schedule again, so the train going to Chicago arrives at 1:30 in the morning, and the train going to Washington, D.C. arrives at 3:30 in the morning, so not good times. So it's the same story up north. On the northern line, Cleveland, the train only stops in the middle of the night. They have 1 train a day in each direction, but that's it. So this is a good picture of Cleveland when there might actually be people at the station, but it's in the middle of the night. So it's not too conducive to having very high ridership with that kind of service. And during the day, it's just quiet at Cleveland. So Cleveland, 5:50 in the morning, going in one direction, 4 a.m. the other direction. And then Toledo, 3 a.m. or 6 a.m. Those are your times you can catch a train. So I guess if you wanted to go to Chicago and you got up early, you'd have to get to the train at 4 in Cleveland or at 6:30 in Toledo to go to Chicago. That's it. And Toledo has a very significant station, very unusual design. So they're not using much of this former huge station anymore. And this picture does show a train sitting in the station. Maybe it's very early in the, but for most of the day it sits quiet, no trains. So also on the northern line in Ohio, there's a station that was built by Amtrak, kind of a concrete bunker type thing in Bryan. And then Sandusky has a regular train station. And then Elyria, another place where Amtrak has spent very little for a shelter, and Alliance, Ohio. And that's it for the state of Ohio. That's it. So let me just show you all the cities where the Amtrak doesn't go to in the middle of the state. It doesn't go to Columbus, the state capital, which is like one of the success stories of Ohio. People have been moving there because of the low housing prices. It doesn't go to Dayton. It doesn't go to Lima. It doesn't go to Mansfield. It doesn't go to a lot of cities. It doesn't go to Youngstown or Akron. I could go on and on. There's just so many places Amtrak doesn't go in the state of Ohio. And they could have networks every which way. And they say it takes a village to raise children in a community. Well, I think it takes all the states doing their part to provide a higher level of train service that not only benefits those states, but also the surrounding states. So right now, there's no connectivity between Ohio and Michigan. There could be. And I talk about Pittsburgh in another video. It gets very little train service in Pittsburgh. Well, if Ohio was having service between Pittsburgh and, say, Columbus, that would help. And it would help increase the train passenger travel in other states, I think, also. And I also indicate two cities south of Ohio, Louisville and Knoxville, which do not get any train traffic right now. And I'll get to that in a minute. And having train travel could maybe revitalize a city like Dayton, has been down on its heels for a while, getting a lot of bad press. So something like this to provide people in Ohio with another way of getting around the state. Again, people are not going to get in a plane and fly between cities. They're going to drive, and that's pretty much the only alternative. And I've been struck when I've been in the state of Ohio, you do see a fair amount of freight train traffic, but you don't see any passenger trains hardly at all. So it just seems kind of like a sterile situation. They need to have another alternative to driving in Ohio. So here's a couple of the stations that used to exist. And in the case of Ohio, they've demolished these stations. So this is the former station at Columbus, which looked terrific, but it's been demolished. And then Dayton had a very attractive station with a Venetian type campanile, something you might see in Siena or Florence. And I think they started demolishing this piece by piece. I don't know what went first, but none of it's there now. So that's what Dayton used to have. And this is what they had inside the Dayton station. Just fantastic. It's all gone. But Lima, Ohio, their station's still there, being used for something else, but something to build on. Okay, let's go to two states that it's just amazing to me that they have virtually no train service at all. They're right in the center of the country, Kentucky and Tennessee. And looking at things regionally, again, look at the state of North Carolina and South Carolina next to these states, and Virginia. They all have much more in the way of passenger trains, but Kentucky and Tennessee, which both states have a rich rail history, virtually nothing. It's just amazing to me. And a lot of people are moving to Tennessee because they have no state income tax. So the state's getting more and more crowded, just like some of the other southern states are, like North Carolina, South Carolina. And the highways are just, you hear about the traffic around Nashville becoming a real problem. And it just seems like Tennessee should be doing something to manage its growth better. So I'll show you some stations that still exist in both states. Let's first talk about Kentucky. Just amazing to me. These are significant states that just have virtually no train service at all. So let's look at the western line that comes down from Chicago. There is one station right on the Tennessee border, a little town of Fulton. And here's, if you can believe it, this is the one station in the western part of Kentucky. It's a trailer, and it's a flag stop, meaning if somebody on the train wants to get off, they have to let the train staff know to stop, or word has to get to the train that somebody wants to get on the train. But if they don't hear anything, they'll just breeze right through. So the train won't even stop here. And it also only stops here in the middle of the night to add everything to the equation. So, but Fulton used to have a very attractive station downtown. And I don't know whether it's still standing, but this is a historical picture of the former station in Fulton. It used to be known as the banana capital of the U.S. 70% of all bananas were shipped through Fulton and distributed from Fulton. It was quite the town in its heyday. Now let's go to the northern part of the state, right along the Ohio River, Maysville, which is the only town with a respectable looking station along the Ohio. This is in Ashland. It's kind of a converted warehouse type building. And South Shore, South Portsmouth, Kentucky just has a shelter, which Amtrak owns. And that's it for Kentucky. Let's look at Tennessee. It'll take even less time for Tennessee. Hard to believe. Because Tennessee, as popular a state as it is, only has 2 train stations in it. And they're on the western side of the state. I mentioned Fulton, which is right just north of the Tennessee border in Kentucky. And the City of New Orleans train goes one a day each direction. And it goes to Memphis. There's just one track serving the Memphis station, and then New Bern, Tennessee, where it only stops in the middle of the night. And I believe this, even though it's a regular station, I believe it's also a flag stop where if, nobody on the train wants to get off and nobody wants to get on, a train just goes right through. So that's it for Tennessee. So let me just show you the cities that don't have train service. First in Kentucky, Louisville, Frankfort, Bowling Green. I didn't put a box around Lexington, but Lexington also, home of the University of Kentucky and the state capital. No train service, just on the edges of the state. Same thing with Tennessee. Doesn't go to Nashville. The train used to go to Chattanooga, the Chattanooga Choo Choo. No more. Knoxville has a couple of beautiful stations, which I feature in another video. No train service currently. So as I mentioned, it does go to Memphis. There's something to build on. And all these cities in both states, and I included Evansville, Indiana, too. There's other fairly good-sized towns in southern Indiana that the train doesn't go to, but could. If there was, again, more of a kind of network like they should do in Ohio, they could do in Kentucky and Tennessee, and connect these cities and give people more opportunity to do something other than driving on highways that are getting increasingly choked. And here's some of the beautiful old stations that are still standing in Louisville. Union Station, built in 1880, beautiful. Bowling Green, Kentucky. Here was the station, at least in Lexington, Kentucky. I don't know if it's still there. And then in Tennessee, Nashville Union Station. What a station. Beautiful. And this is a historical photograph of Chattanooga when this was still a train station. The building still stands. It's now being used as a hotel, but this is the level of train stations that they had in Tennessee. Beautiful. And then when I walked around the stations in Knoxville, this is the former Southern Railroad station in Knoxville. Beautiful. Dutch Revival style, as is the former Louisville and Nashville train station in Knoxville, now being used as a high school. Okay, so those states have their work cut out for them. And now I'll talk about the last state that I found surprising, that it doesn't have a greater level of train service, Texas. One of the most populated states, state that a lot of people are moving to, again, because they have no state income tax. A lot of Californians are moving to Texas and from all over, and their highways are getting more and more crowded. So here is the train service that does exist in Texas. So the line that goes across east-west on the southern part of the state is another one of those train lines, like the Cardinal train from Chicago to DC. This train goes from New Orleans to Los Angeles, and it only goes 3 times a week in each direction, through Houston, San Antonio, and El Paso, through the southern part of the state. And then the service is a little more often every day from San Antonio up towards Fort Worth and Dallas, and then Dallas over to Arkansas, heading up towards Chicago. Trains that run through the Sunset Limited is the one that only runs 3 days a week in each direction. They have the Texas Eagle, and then the Heartland Flyer is a train that Oklahoma and Kansas support. It goes from Fort Worth north up to Oklahoma. So I'll start off with what I find to be unbelievable. Houston. This is the fourth biggest city in the US, and this is their train station in Houston. And in another video, I show how they've repurposed one of their old train stations. It's now built into the baseball stadium in Houston. Very unusual. It's actually the main entrance to the baseball stadium, but this is what they have now. And you can see highways flying overhead, sort of a shabby little station, nothing to look at. This is all they have in Houston. And I also mention this because there's been a lot of talk about there being a high-speed rail line built between Dallas and Houston, and it's the optimal distance. It's like 230 miles. That's the sweet spot for high-speed rail. That would make it faster than driving or flying a plane. But I don't know how strong that project really is, because this is the level of service that they have now. This is how much train service is valued right now in Houston. And San Antonio station doesn't blow you away either. It's functional. Here's another station in that southern line, Beaumont, San Marcos. Going up north, Austin. I thought train travel would be a bigger deal. It's supposed to be a very progressive city. I looked at the ridership, and it doesn't blow you away, train ridership in Austin. So underwhelming. Taylor, really rough. Finally, Temple, Texas has a respectable looking station. Attractive. But go back down again to McGregor, Texas, on our way towards Dallas-Fort Worth. And then this station really got me in Cleburne. It doesn't even look like there's any kind of platform. Like you have to come out of the station, walk across the grass, and then step up into the train. It's not even really like there's a station house, but it's not like a proper way to get on a train, unless I'm missing something here, but that's just the way it looks like in the picture. And then Fort Worth has a respectable looking station. It's also where their regional commuter rail service is, so it has more platforms for that, but Amtrak uses this station also. And then Dallas has an attractive station, so that's something. And going north, this is the one station in Texas on the way to Oklahoma from Fort Worth, Gainesville. And then on the line going east from Dallas towards Arkansas, this is Mineola, not to be confused with Mineola, Long Island, New York. Longview, Texas. Marshall, Texas, which has got an interesting looking station. Marshall Depot. And Del Rio, Texas is way down in the southern line. I'm saving one more station up in the northern part of the state for last. So I'm just showing you the stations that go from San Antonio to El Paso. So here's Del Rio. We're going west. This is Sanderson, which is a very lightly populated area in West Texas, but it's an attractive shelter. Alpine, Texas. Then El Paso Union Depot is a very attractive station. It's designed by Daniel Burnham, who also designed Washington Union Station and Chicago Union Station and the Flatiron Building in New York and Chicago World's Fair. Very prominent architect. He designed a station in El Paso. Very attractive. Okay, but then on the other end of the spectrum, I'm going to show you a station that's going to be shocking. So, fair warning. Right on the Texas-Arkansas border, the border actually runs right through the town, Texarkana, and this is the train station there. Once glorious, once beautiful, but it's kind of got a Gary, Indiana problem. It's got windows knocked out, really has been left to decay. I hope the roof hasn't fallen in, but Texarkana, I've seen videos of that city too, where there's hardly anybody walking around the downtown. It's very bleak and a lot of boarded up buildings. It's a shame. It has a lot of great architecture. So it'd be nice if something could be done to help bring Texarkana back, including fixing up the train station. So those are the passenger rail deserts and the states that are within them. And I talked about Texas and being in the outback. I'll show you some cities in the outback where there used to be train service. There could still be train service if Texas wanted to help support such service in the future. And the whole northwestern part of the state, unserved, as well as the southern part of the state. So you've got cities like Amarillo, Lubbock, Midland, Abilene, Laredo, Brownsville, Corpus Christi, Victoria, all without train service. And I also put in College Station, where Texas A&M University is located north of Houston. No train service. So Texas could do a lot to improve train travel within the state. And here's that high-speed line that has been talked about between Dallas and Houston that could also stop at College Station en route. And here's some of the stations from yesteryear that are still standing. Lubbock. Well, Midland had a station that looked like Lubbock. I don't know if it's still standing, but that's what was in Midland. And Amarillo, Santa Fe Railroad. Good sized station being unused. And way down at the southern end of the state, Corpus Christi has a station that once had train service, as did Brownsville. Very attractive Spanish colonial design. So those are the states that I think could do a lot better than what they have now. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.